Today we're looking at cowboys and the cattle kingdom. Hello, welcome to the Daily Bellringer. Please don't forget to subscribe and take a look at the questions down in the description. Also, don't forget to check out dailybellringer.com where you'll find more resources that go with many of the Bellringer videos. During the colonial period, the Spanish had settled much of what would become the southwest region of the United States. With them, they brought longhorn cattle. These cattle spread throughout the Southwest, but especially in Texas, where there were large, open, grassy plains on which to feed. These cattle traveled in herds, and eventually by the early to mid-1800s, as Texas was becoming the 28th state, ranchers began to round up these herds and claim them as their own. Since there weren't fences and the cattle herds roamed, the ranchers would brand the cattle to indicate who owned them. For many years, ranching was not a very profitable business, as there wasn't really a tremendous need for beef in the West, as most of the population of the United States lived in the northeastern part of the country. But that all changed as railroads began to reach further and further west. In September of 1865, shortly after the American Civil War had come to an end, the Missouri Pacific Railroad established tracks leading all the way to Kansas City, Missouri. Now ranchers in Texas could drive their herds, sometimes numbering over 200,000 head of cattle, to Missouri, load them on trains, and ship them to the east to be sold at markets. The value of cattle exploded, going from $3 per head to $40 per head of cattle. From the late 1860s through the late 1880s, the cattle business became a dominant economic activity throughout the West. As the expansion of railroads continued to the west with the establishment of the Transcontinental Railroad, so too did the growth of the cattle market, and now ranchers were taking their herds on several different long drives or different routes to get them to railroad hubs to be shipped east. The long drives would start in Texas and end at cow towns such as Cheyenne, Wyoming, Ogallala, Nebraska, Topeka and Dodge City, Kansas, and Sedalia, Missouri, where cattle would be loaded on trains. These cow towns boomed and became thriving and sometimes wild communities, with businesses such as saloons, hotels, and gambling establishments being established. Of course, to drive these large herds across the hundreds of miles of open plains, ranchers hired cowhands or cowboys to travel the route and bring the herds to market. Cowboys actually trace their roots to the Spanish, who originally had large ranches with cowhands known as vaqueros, who were famous for their skills riding a horse and roping cattle. Many of the cowboys were veterans from the Civil War who had moved to the West after the war to find a better life. Nearly 25% of cowboys were African Americans who too had moved west in an effort to better themselves after the Civil War. Being a cowboy was a dangerous and uncomfortable job, living outside on the trail for months at a time, constantly being on watch for cattle getting out of control in a stampede, or trying to fight off cattle rustlers who were people who attempted to steal cattle from the herd. The image and idea of cowboys became very romanticized or almost mythical in the eastern part of the United States. The average herd numbered around 3,000 head of cattle, with usually about 10 cowboys riding with the herd to keep them in order. The traveling herd would also include generally a cook who would drive what was known as the chuck wagon that carried food for the cowboys. Along with the herds as well were large numbers of horses, as each cowboy would generally need 3 to 4 horses to keep up with the demand of constantly rounding up the herds. The cattle drives themselves usually lasted between 3 to 5 months, with the drives usually departing in spring to ensure there would be plenty of grass along the way for the cattle to feed on. A herd could travel as far as 25 miles in a day, but interestingly, driving cattle long distances in a day would cause the cattle to lose weight, which would drive down their value when they reached the market. So most cowboys drove their cattle usually 10 to 12 miles each day and then gave them plenty of time to graze to maintain their weight. In October of 1873, Joseph Glidden, a farmer from Illinois, submitted an application for a patent on a new kind of fence with sharp metal barbs on it. Known as barbed wire fencing, this new invention would revolutionize the cattle industry and bring to an end the era of free-roaming cattle. Barbed wire fencing could be put up cheaply and surround large areas for cattle to graze. As more railroads were built across the entire United States, the need to drive cattle to railheads diminished and the need for long cattle drives was gone. But the time period of the cattle kingdom from the 1860s to the 1880s would forever be part of the Wild West. So with that, hopefully you learned something, and thanks for watching.